You should all have in your packets a summary of 14 criteria. You might want to pull those out of your packets because I'll be referring to those in the course of my lecture. I'm not going to have a PowerPoint. This is your PowerPoint. Summary of 14 criteria to distinguish between ethical and unethical evangelism. Thank you for inviting me to this conference. It is always a little risky to ask a philosopher to speak at a conference, especially one that comes from Canada. Here is one description of philosophers that I rather like and that explains the risk. Philosophers are people who talk about stuff they don't understand and then make it sound like it's everybody else's fault. Unfortunately, there is some truth to that description. I hope it won't be the case this afternoon. The title for my paper, The Ethics of Evangelism in Health Care. I have chosen to use the word evangelism instead of witness in the title of my paper. Both words are really broad and have various meanings, but I want to use the word evangelism in its narrow sense of giving verbal witness to the truth of the Christian faith. There might even be an element of persuasion involved in evangelism. Ultimately, the goal of evangelism is conversion. Alan Kreider describes conversion as involving a change of a person's belief, belonging, and behavior. So evangelism seeks to bring about, facilitate that kind of conversion. And the central question I want to address in my presentation is whether it is appropriate to engage in evangelism within the context of providing health care. I will be focusing on interpersonal evangelism, a doctor or a nurse witnessing to a patient within a clinical setting or within the general context of health care. Various presentations have already alluded to a recent development in the field of healthcare that relates to the central question of my paper. There would seem to be a greater willingness to talk about the place of spirituality and religion in providing health care. Mark Krasuski, in an article published in 2007 entitled Talking About Spirituality in the Clinical Setting, reviews various dimensions of this new emphasis on spirituality and health care. At the same time, there is considerable resistance, reticence to these developments, especially when it comes to the area of evangelism. The ideals of neutrality and professional distance continue to shape medical practice as they do other professions like teaching, which I am more familiar with. Take, for example, this comment by a Christian physician who was asked by a Christian colleague of his, "How do you do evangelism in your practice?" His response was, "I don't believe it is the place of a doctor to evangelize. It is both unprofessional and unethical." Even Krasuski, who makes a strong case for clinicians becoming more transparent about their own values and their own worldviews when dealing with conflicts regarding treatment plans for patients, ends his essay with some cautions in this regard. He worries that a call for more transparency will lead physicians to inappropriately shift the focus to themselves and their beliefs, and perhaps even to engage in proselytizing. So for Krasuski, proselytizing patients is inappropriate. Sometimes healthcare institutions themselves have policies in place that prohibit evangelism. For example, the Department of Health in the United Kingdom recently published some guidelines defining how far public sector workers can go in communicating the faith in the workplace. And the document has a special section on proselytizing, where all employees of the organizations falling under the National Health Services are warned that they're subject to disciplinary procedures if they engage in evangelism. And these guidelines and disciplinary procedures were the basis of an action taken by the North Somerset Primary Care Trust in December of 2008 against a community supply nurse, an evangelical Christian, who engaged in what they thought was a form of proselytizing in doing her job. And the story made the British headlines. Carolyn Petrie, after she addressed her patient's legs, asked if she would like to say a prayer, and the patient politely declined, and Carolyn simply wished her well and went off. A few days later, Carolyn was summoned to an hour-long disciplinary hearing and formally suspended based on the new policy directives of the National Health Services. It's strange because this isn't even a clear case of evangelism, and I'll come back to this case later on. This worry about healthcare workers engaging in proselytizing is an expression of a broader worry, a broader, very prevalent suspicion about evangelism and proselytizing that permeates the Western world. I want to begin by addressing this more general suspicion, drawing on my recent book, The Ethics of Evangelism, A Philosophical Defense of Ethical Proselytizing and Persuasion. The details of this book are in your handout that you should have in your packet there. And then I want to address the issue of proselytizing in relation to the healthcare context, and I will argue that it is ethically appropriate for a physician or a nurse to engage in evangelism within a clinical setting, though such engagement is subject to some ethical constraints. So first, let me give you a brief overview of my book, which will set the framework for the rest of my treatment of ethics in the context of health care and the ethics of evangelism. I had three objectives in mind when I wrote the book. First of all, to defend evangelism against a whole series of objections that are commonly made. Then to provide a more positive and constructive defense of evangelism. And then to develop some criteria to distinguish between ethical and unethical evangelism. And I might add that this book grew out of some discomfort that I had with an evangelical emphasis on evangelism. And I was trying to work out why I felt a bit unhappy with this emphasis. The book was written with two readerships in mind: skeptics who are opposed to religion, and religious adherents, especially evangelical Christians, who are very much committed to evangelism. And writing for these two different readerships is a challenge, and you don't generally make either group happy, and I have been criticized by both groups. But let me highlight two aspects of that challenge. One was, what word do I use? Evangelism or proselytizing? Evangelism is a word that is favored by evangelical Christians. Proselytizing is a word that's favored by secular academics. So I included both of the words in my title and subtitle, and I treat them as synonyms. I don't want to take time to get into the controversy about the relationship between these two words, but I want to use evangelism as a neutral term from an ethical point of view, and then go on to say that evangelism can be either ethical or unethical. So I will stay primarily with the word evangelism. The second challenge I faced in writing a book for these two very different readerships involves the question of the ethical framework to use in dealing with the ethics of evangelism. Is it even possible to have a common ethical framework for believers and those who are not believers? I believe that it is possible. A common ethical framework is possible, but I don't have time to argue this point here. Instead, I simply want to suggest that the dignity and care of persons is foundational to ethics and can be agreed to by both groups. It was Immanuel Kant in the 18th century who gave us the modern and the secular version of an ethical theory that was based on the dignity of persons. Kant maintained that we should always treat human beings as ends in themselves, never simply as a means to an end. Now, historically, this emphasis on the dignity of human beings has led to an ethics based on rights and duties, and some feminist writers have criticized this kind of an ethics and have suggested that we also need to emphasize an ethics of care. So I think a better approach to ethics is to combine an ethics based on the dignity of persons, and then also add the notion of care and concern for persons. As Christians, there is, of course, a theological basis for appealing to the dignity of persons as a foundation for ethics. We're all created in the image of God. We're also called to love our neighbor. So there you have the ethics of care emerging here. So my hope is that all, or at least most people, will accept the dignity and care of persons as an adequate foundation for ethics. There are many people today who would condemn most or even all evangelism as unethical. Objections to evangelism can be categorized in two broad categories. First, some objections are empirical in nature. For example, it is argued that efforts at evangelism have harmful consequences for the individual or for society at large. Some critics argue that evangelism leads to resentment, hatred, disunity in society, and even holy wars. Sadly, there is some truth to these empirically based objections. But we need to be fair. All too often, claims about the harmful consequences of evangelism involve sweeping generalizations with hardly any concern for actual concrete evidence. And critics, I think, often load the dice by talking about fanatic evangelists, or irrational or aggressive evangelists. And yes, they do have harmful consequences, but you don't have to be fanatical when you evangelize. And what about the counter-evidence? The countless individuals who have received relief from guilt after responding to a proclamation of the message of forgiveness in Jesus Christ. And what about the religious revivals that have led to significant moral improvement within a society? So there are also positive spins to the empirical evidence that can be given. So I conclude that the empirically based objections to evangelism aren't as strong as is commonly assumed. I can't argue this at length. Read my book. How is that for unethical persuasion? The second and more common kind of objection to evangelism is conceptual in nature. It is often argued that there are certain characteristics of evangelism that make evangelism unethical by its very nature. Some critics argue that persuasion is immoral by its very nature. Others focus specifically on religious persuasion and argue that because religious claims cannot be substantiated, therefore religious persuasion is unethical. Still others maintain that evangelism is arrogant or intolerant. Some critics question the motivation behind evangelism. And then, of course, there's the charge that evangelism is coercive by its very nature. I argue that each of these objections against evangelism is unsound, based on problematic assumptions and questionable definitions, and I'm going to illustrate some of these a bit later on. So blanket condemnations of evangelism, or claims to the effect that evangelism is inherently unethical, I think these are simply unwarranted. This does not mean that these charges are never appropriate. The history of the Christian church is littered with evangelistic malpractice, including the use of coercion and coercive techniques to achieve conversion. And this calls for repentance. At the same time, we can and we should defend ourselves against arguments suggesting that ethical evangelism is impossible. I could go on to also talk about a positive case for evangelism. Like evangelism is an expression of a person's own identity, one's own dignity. We all are evangelists. We're all trying to persuade others about our points of view. And John Stuart Mill has given an interesting argument suggesting that really persuasion about religious matters is good for society as a whole. So again, my positive defense of evangelism is not meant to rule out the possibility of there being unethical methods of evangelism. We can neither approve or disapprove of evangelism generally, nor condemn it outright, as is sadly all too often done. Instead, I think we need to pay more attention to the criteria to distinguish between ethical and unethical evangelism. And that brings me to the next section of my paper, and here I'll be referring to the criteria that we have here. I'll skip some comments I wanted to make about these criteria. The first two criteria are foundational in nature. Section A in your handout. The first criterion gives expression to the principle of dignity I have already referred to as the foundation of ethics being assumed in my paper. And this needs to be coupled with a criterion of care. Now, these principles are pretty broad, and as such might not be thought to hold much ethical punch, but I think they do. Patients must never be seen as mere objects of a physician's proselytizing program. Ethical physicians and nurses also care for their patients and care for them as whole persons, and that includes their spiritual needs. Medical practitioners also need to protect the dignity and worth of each patient, regardless of their religious or non-religious beliefs. I move on to Section B, the criteria dealing with coercion. One important dimension of treating people with dignity involves respecting their freedom to make choices. Now, while I believe that there are evangelistic approaches that are coercive and hence immoral, I believe the charge of coercion is not as easy to substantiate as is often assumed. Of course, if you assume that human beings are all determined by their very nature, then of course all evangelism becomes coercive. But that's a questionable assumption that I don't agree with. I prefer to talk about degrees of freedom. But once you talk about degrees of freedom, there's a vagueness that comes into play in terms of applying the issue of, or making the charge of coercion. I suggest we need to distinguish between 4 types of coercion. Number 3 to 6 in your handout. Physical, psychological, social, and inducements to convert. Physical coercion is easier to deal with. It would obviously be wrong to try and convert a patient by threatening him or her with a lethal injection. The next 2 criteria are a bit more difficult because vagueness comes into play. Ethical proselytizing avoids psychological coercion, but what is psychological coercion? That, I think, is the problem. And here I think we need to keep in mind that to some extent we're all involved in psychologically manipulating one another. And I'm using the word manipulate in a neutral sense. We can't avoid some manipulation. It's when manipulation becomes excessive that I think it becomes immoral. Applying that to the healthcare context, a good doctor or a nurse will use a variety of psychological techniques to get their patient to do what they want them to do. And that's okay. It's only when these techniques become excessively manipulative, that I think it becomes immoral. With regard to power, a physician has power over the patient. Again, it's excessive use of power that becomes, I think, immoral and problematic. So let me say a bit about vulnerability with regard to psychological coercion. And here I'd like to mention that all of us are vulnerable. All human beings are vulnerable. I think in healthcare we're dealing with extremes of vulnerability, and therefore we need to take special care not to exploit that vulnerability. The same regards power imbalances. There's nothing wrong with having authority and power over an individual, but it's when it becomes excessive that it becomes problematic. I face the problem of power imbalance when I'm teaching. I have power as a professor. The question is, when am I using that in an excessive way? That's when it becomes problematic. So I think all of us need to be very sensitive to an excessive imbalance of power when we are dealing with patients in the clinical setting. There's also the problem of inducement to convert. Clearly, for a nurse to give a patient $1,000 cash to induce a patient to convert to Christianity would be wrong. That's the obvious case. But what about the more subtle kinds of inducement, like kindness, caring for a person? It in itself creates a kind of inducement to convert. And I think we have to, again, accept that as normal. It is only when inducement becomes excessive that problems arise. Let me move on to some epistemological, ethical concerns. Section C in your outline, the next page. I could spend a lot of time on rationality as a philosopher, but I won't do that. Truthfulness. We ought to be truthful. There ought to be an integrity about what we're doing as nurses and as doctors. And I think that integrity involves transparency also. To pretend to be neutral would be dishonest. And that is why in the classroom I have made it a point to tell my students that they're stuck with a Christian philosopher and that everything that I say will be colored by a Christian worldview. And I have very seldom had my students complain about my indoctrinating them. Evangelism must also be conducted with humility. And I think, again, very important that we don't appear to be arrogant. Sometimes it's thought that evangelism is arrogant by its very nature, but I don't think it is. Making claims to truth, while it sounds arrogant, isn't arrogant in a pejorative sense. We all make claims to truth. We all disagree with others about the claims that we make. Then, criteria relating to pluralism. Is my time up? No. Tolerance is a big concern here. Unfortunately, misconceptions about tolerance abound. Tolerance means putting up with that which you disagree. It doesn't mean you have to like something to be tolerant. It simply means you put up with. Unfortunately, today, tolerance has come to mean that we not only have to put up with, but that we have to agree with, that we have to like that which we disagree with. And I think that's a distortion of the notion of tolerance. It rests on a relativistic understanding of truth, and I think ultimately it's the height of intolerance to force everybody to believe that all beliefs are equally valid. We need the old-fashioned value of tolerance, putting up with. The tolerance criterion is closely related to the identity criterion of ethical evangelism. We must not only talk about the individual, but the individual as part of a community, and part of the dignity of a person is connected with that person's identity in a community. So therefore, ethical evangelism will respect the communal identity of the person. So how do we apply these to the healthcare context? When doctors and nurses introduce spiritual topics with their patients, and when such discussions move into overt evangelism, tolerance and respect will again need to characterize the dialogue. I don't think this precludes criticism, gentle criticism, humble criticism of positions made. I don't think that's intolerant. But it must be respectful, and you must avoid hostile attitudes, insulting language, and that sort of thing. Number 12, the golden rule of evangelism. Freud illustrated this point so well in a humorous story about a minister who was summoned by anxious relatives to try and extract a deathbed conversion from an atheistic and unrepentant insurance salesman. The meeting did occur. Indeed, the longer the minister and the salesman continued to converse behind the closed door of the hospital ward, the more the concerned family members had hope. When the door finally opened, however, the salesman had not been converted, writes Freud, but the pastor went away insured. At least the pastor was practicing reciprocal evangelism, where the patient can also evangelize the physician. The final two criteria of ethical evangelism have to do with motivation for evangelism and the concern with success about evangelism. And I will say very little about these except to note that it's very, very difficult to assess the motivation of people when they're evangelizing. So I think we need to be very cautious in this regard. If we had time, we can look at the three cases that I started out with, but I won't take the time. Instead, come to my conclusion. My conclusion is evangelism is sometimes acceptable in the context of health care. However, there are ethical principles that govern the way in which evangelism should be practiced. Indeed, these ethical principles will function as constraints in regard to how one does evangelism. In the case of professions like education and healthcare, these constraints will in fact be quite stringent. This is because educators and physicians hold positions of authority over their students and patients. Given these constraints, it will be seen that my position is really quite close to that of Krasuski, who I started out with. Except that Krasuski rules out any evangelism. I think that's where he's wrong. He admits that we need more transparency on the part of physicians with regard to their own worldview, but he stops at the area of evangelism, and I think in this he is wrong. I believe evangelism is morally permissible in the healthcare setting if practiced with ethical integrity. Thank you.